On the morning of June 9, 1944, at precisely 7:22, a German officer approached Sergeant Jake Callister with a white flag in hand, backed by 700 soldiers, and proceeded to demand that he surrender. Jake was 25 years old at the time, sporting a mohawk haircut and face paint arranged in war stripes, with 8 disciplinary incidents on his record, and having never risen above the rank of private, now finding himself encircled by German forces with only 35 men under his command, completely out of food and water, defending a bridge that his own Air Force had just finished destroying. The German officer made adjustments to his uniform before laying out the circumstances in clear terms. The American position was cut off entirely. There would be no reinforcements arriving, no supply deliveries, and no route of escape available to them. From a logical standpoint, surrender represented the only sensible course of action. Jake surveyed the 700 German soldiers arrayed before him, then looked back at his 35 paratroopers. He then informed the German officer that 3 distinct options lay before him. The first option was to withdraw and retreat. The second option involved sitting down to negotiate terms. The third option meant launching an uphill assault against fortified machine gun emplacements manned by soldiers who'd been reduced to eating grass for the past 3 days and were, as you might imagine, exceptionally angry about their situation. The German officer made his choice and selected option 3. 72 hours after that decision, 700 German soldiers lay dead or wounded on that hillside. Among Jake's 35 men, there were 0 casualties. During his training period, the Army had attempted to discharge Jake Callister on 8 separate occasions. He'd broken a staff sergeant's nose during an argument over butter, fired 2 military police officers' pistols into a street sign, consistently refused to salute officers, and never once followed a single regulation that he didn't personally agree with. Despite all that, he went on to survive D-Day after his aircraft exploded at 1,500 feet, successfully defended a bridge against an entire battalion with just 35 soldiers, parachuted into the surrounded town of Bastogne, coordinated 247 resupply drops while under German fire, and ultimately returned home, where he spent the next 40 years selling stamps in Oklahoma. The thing you have to understand about Jake Callister is that he never harbored any ambitions of becoming a soldier. His goals were straightforward and simple. Kill Nazis, have a good breakfast, and return home safely. The Army spent 4 full years coming to the realization that the only effective way to utilize Jake Callister was to simply stop attempting to control every aspect of his behavior. Here's the crucial thing you need to grasp about Jake Callister's character. His hatred of authority didn't stem from some rebellious streak or desire to be difficult. Jake despised authority because, in his experience, authority figures were often incompetent, and their poor decisions resulted in men losing their lives. Jake's childhood unfolded during the Great Depression in Oklahoma, where he was one of 10 siblings in his family. His family managed to survive by relying on hunting, fishing, and trapping for their sustenance. By the time Jake reached 10 years of age, he'd already learned how to kill animals to put food on the table. At 19, he became a firefighter. After the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, his occupation meant he was actually exempt from being drafted. He chose to volunteer, regardless. It wasn't because he felt some overwhelming love for his country, and it wasn't because fascism offended his political sensibilities. Jake's motivation for volunteering came down to the fact that paratroopers got the opportunity to jump behind enemy lines carrying explosives, and as he put it in his own words, deprive the enemy of anything nice they might have had. The military assigned him to Fort Benning, where he would undergo basic training. His commanding officer posed a question, asking whether Jake had a clear understanding of what military discipline entailed. Jake responded with a simple, "Sure." Within his first week there, he found himself in a physical altercation with a staff sergeant. The incident occurred because the sergeant had confiscated Jake's butter ration during breakfast. Jake made a polite request to have it returned to him. The sergeant's response was to tell him to be quiet and continue eating his meal. Jake's response was to break the sergeant's nose. That same day, Jake went on to set the course record during demolition training. He completed the course faster than any other recruit in the entire history of Fort Benning had ever managed. His commanding officer found himself both impressed by Jake's performance and simultaneously furious with his behavior, confronted with the reality that Jake Callister represented both the most skilled soldier in the entire training class and the most significant headache the Army had ever encountered. Jake flatly refused to address officers as "Sir," unless he felt they had personally earned that level of respect from him. He refused to salute the flag during morning formation ceremonies, refused to stand at attention when ordered, and refused to comply with any regulation that struck him as serving no practical purpose. Whenever someone questioned why he couldn't simply behave like a normal, regulation-following soldier, Jake would clearly articulate his reasoning and perspective. He'd enlisted for the specific purpose of killing Nazis, not to participate in what he characterized as the dog and pony show that comprised the United States military bureaucracy. Given his attitude and behavior, he should have been immediately discharged from service. Instead, the leadership made a brilliant decision that proved unexpectedly effective. They made the choice to isolate him from the regular forces, providing Jake with his own platoon to command, his own barracks to occupy, and his own dedicated space to operate within. Whenever another soldier showed up who displayed similar insubordination issues, someone who couldn't follow standard regulations but possessed too much combat skill to simply discharge, the leadership would transfer that soldier directly to Jake's platoon. Within a 6-month period, Jake had assembled a group of 12 other men around him. Every single one of them had discipline problems on their records. Every single one of them was an exceptional soldier in terms of combat ability. They gave themselves the nickname, the Filthy 13. Each man had been reassigned to Jake's platoon for fundamentally the same underlying reason. They were too valuable in terms of combat effectiveness to discharge from service, yet simultaneously too dangerous and disruptive to maintain alongside regular troops. Among them was Jack Wimmer, who'd worked as a coal miner in Pennsylvania. He'd gotten into a physical fight with 3 military police officers over a poker game dispute. He managed to break all 3 of their noses. Despite his discipline problems, he was recognized as the best marksman in the entire 101st Airborne Division. There was Charles Plowo, an Italian immigrant from New York, who could speak 4 different languages fluently. The Army caught him operating a black market scheme where he sold military supplies to local civilians. The military chose to retain him in service because his language skills meant he could interrogate prisoners in German, Italian, French, and English with equal proficiency. Robert Kahn hailed from Tennessee and was considered an expert when it came to working with explosives. He'd been arrested after deliberately blowing up a latrine facility because he wanted to observe the explosion pattern and found it interesting from a technical perspective. The Army found his theory validated by the results. They transferred him to Jake's platoon the very next day after the incident. Joe Aliskowich came from Chicago's streets, where he'd become a boxing champion and accomplished street fighter. During his time in basic training, he'd been involved in 14 documented fistfights. He emerged victorious from all 14 encounters. Eventually, the Army simply gave up trying to discipline him and made the decision to send him to serve under Jake. Every single one of these men struggled with the same fundamental issue. They proved incapable of following orders they considered stupid when those orders came from officers they viewed as mediocre. Yet every single one of them possessed exactly the qualities and characteristics that Jake was looking for in soldiers. Jake had come to understand something that the Army as an institution completely failed to grasp. Discipline and obedience are two fundamentally different concepts that shouldn't be confused with each other. Obedience consists of doing whatever you're told without raising questions or concerns. Discipline means doing whatever needs to be accomplished, especially when the task is difficult or unpleasant. The men serving under Jake possessed genuine discipline in abundance. Their training regimen was more intense than any other unit's. They could shoot with greater accuracy, run with more speed and endurance, and could complete ruck marches lasting for days without voicing a single complaint. However, they adamantly refused to waste their valuable time on parade ground formations, obsessively polishing their boots to a mirror shine, or saluting officers who'd never experienced actual combat situations. Jake managed the Filthy 13 using principles similar to how a wolf pack operates. There was no unnecessary hierarchy to navigate, no pointless rules to memorize, just a single guiding principle that governed everything. Either be competent at your job or remove yourself from the unit. If you demonstrated the ability to shoot accurately, carry heavy loads over long distances, fight effectively, and follow Jake into situations that seemed impossible, then you belonged with the group. If you couldn't meet those standards, Jake would personally see to your removal himself. The Army's leadership absolutely hated this arrangement. Officers filed complaints on a constant basis, arguing that Jake's platoon was actively undermining military order and the concept of discipline itself. Jake's response remained consistent and never varied, regardless of who complained. He told them that when regular soldiers could outperform his men in shooting, marching, and fighting, only then would he give any consideration to following their regulations and rules. That response typically shut down most of the complaints pretty effectively. The Filthy 13 developed a legendary reputation throughout Fort Benning. Other soldiers would observe them during training sessions, watching as they completely demolished every physical standard the Army had established, watching as they violated every social rule in the book while somehow getting away with it completely. Some officers wanted to see them brought up on court-martial charges. Others expressed interest in studying their methods and effectiveness. Most officers simply wanted them transferred somewhere else and out of their jurisdiction. But despite all the controversy, nobody could argue against or deny the results they produced. Whenever the 101st Airborne conducted qualification tests, Jake's platoon consistently scored higher than every other unit, and they did so every single time, without exception. In marksmanship competitions, they achieved the top scores. In demolitions testing, they claimed the top scores again. When it came to hand-to-hand combat tournaments, Jake's men emerged victorious in every competition they entered. The only category where they consistently failed was uniform inspections, and that's simply because none of them could be bothered to care about that particular standard. Before the unit received orders to deploy to England, Jake experienced one final confrontation with the military police. Jake and his men had been drinking at a bar located near Fort Benning, and they were off duty, off base, and minding their own business without causing any problems. 2 military police officers walked into the establishment and immediately started harassing Jake's soldiers without provocation. One of the MPs attempted to place one of Jake's men under arrest on charges of being drunk and disorderly. Jake rose from his seat and inquired whether there was some kind of problem that needed addressing. The MP's response was to tell Jake to sit back down and keep his mouth shut. Jake proceeded to break that MP's jaw, then moved on to break the second MP's jaw as well. Following that, he confiscated both of their Colt 1911 pistols, walked outside into the street, and proceeded to fire all 16 rounds into a street sign that happened to be nearby. After emptying both weapons, he went back inside the bar and waited patiently for the MPs to regain consciousness so he could turn himself into them properly. The MPs arrested Jake and brought him before his commanding officer for disciplinary action. The officer carefully reviewed Jake's entire service record. 8 separate disciplinary write-ups, multiple assault charges, and constant insubordination throughout his service. By all rights, he should have immediately court-martialed Jake on the spot. Instead, he proposed a deal that offered Jake an alternative path. There existed a record for completing a ruck march covering 136 miles from Fort Benning to another base facility. Very few soldiers throughout military history had ever successfully completed that particular march. The officer explained that if Jake and his men would attempt to complete the march, he would agree to overlook the entire MP incident and drop all charges. Jake accepted the terms, but he insisted on adding one additional condition to the agreement. He stated that he would complete all 136 miles of the march without changing his socks even once and without developing a single blister on his feet. The commanding officer couldn't help but laugh at the claim. He stated that what Jake was proposing was physically impossible to achieve. Jake's response was simple and direct. "Watch me." 10 days later, Jake successfully completed all 136 miles while carrying full combat gear and a 60-pound ruck on his back. And he did so without getting any blisters while maintaining perfectly healthy feet. The Army medical staff examined his feet and simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jake's explanation for this achievement was characteristically straightforward and simple. He'd been walking and doing physical labor since he was 10 years old. His feet had developed tougher skin than any boot leather could possibly provide. The commanding officer honored his word as promised and dropped all the charges against Jake. Jake and the Filthy 13 received their deployment orders and shipped out to England in early 1944. Once their boots hit British soil, Jake's men immediately began creating problems for the local authorities. The British maintained strict food rationing policies, and they had clear rules. No hunting was permitted, no fishing was allowed, and there was definitely no poaching on any property belonging to the king. Jake took one look at the meager British rations they were being provided, then looked out at the surrounding countryside where he could clearly see deer, rabbits, and pheasants roaming freely. He made the decision to start hunting using his M1 Garand rifle, used military-issued explosives for fishing purposes, and trapped rabbits using techniques he'd learned back in Oklahoma. Within just a few weeks, Jake's platoon was eating considerably better than the officers were. They were also, it should be noted, violating approximately 47 different British laws in the process. A local landowner filed a formal lawsuit against the United States government. His claim stated that American soldiers were illegally hunting game animals on his property. Jake's commanding officer summoned him to his office and asked directly if Jake was the one responsible for these activities. Jake confirmed that yes, he was responsible. He explained that his men required proper nutrition if they were going to be expected to jump into France and effectively kill Germans. The officer asked what Jake expected him to do about the situation. The lawsuit represented a serious diplomatic problem. Jake looked his commanding officer directly in the eye and asked, "What are you going to do about it? Send me on some impossible jump mission into German-occupied territory?" Then Jake allowed himself a smile and added that he was actually quite enthusiastic about that particular prospect. The officer suddenly realized the fundamental problem he was dealing with. You simply cannot threaten a man with more danger when that man has already volunteered for the most dangerous assignment the military has to offer. Jake managed to avoid punishment once again. On June 5th, 1944, Jake Callister and the Filthy 13 began their final preparations to jump into Normandy. Jake had applied white war paint to his face in distinctive stripes and given himself a mohawk haircut for the occasion. Some of the men serving under him had taken things even further and shaved their heads completely bald. A photographer from Stars and Stripes happened to see them in this state and took several pictures of the group. Those photographs would go on to become the most famous and iconic images of D-Day paratroopers in existence, the exact ones you've seen reproduced in every World War II documentary ever made. That's Jake Callister in those photos, the guy who looked like an absolute psychopath, and as it turns out, acted the part pretty convincingly, too. At 11:47 in the evening on June 5th, Jake's C-47 transport aircraft lifted off from its airfield in England. Their destination was designated as Drop Zone A, located near the town of Carentan, France. The operational plan was straightforward and uncomplicated. They would jump from the aircraft at 1,000 feet altitude, link up with other paratroopers after landing, then secure various bridges and road intersections to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. At 1:23 in the morning on June 6th, Jake's aircraft crossed over the French coastline. German anti-aircraft fire erupted immediately in response to their approach. 88mm flak guns, 37mm cannons, and tracer rounds filled the night sky with deadly fire. The C-47 began shaking violently from the concussions and near misses. Jake's jump master issued the order for everyone to stand up and hook their static lines to the cable. At 1:26 in the morning, an 88mm shell made a direct hit on the C-47's fuel tank. The resulting explosion tore completely through the aircraft's structure. The fuel immediately ignited into flames. The plane's entire tail section separated from the main fuselage. Men who hadn't yet exited the aircraft found themselves thrown into the night sky without having pulled their ripcords. Jake was standing in the doorway preparing to jump when the plane exploded around him. The force of the blast threw him backward through the air. His static line deployed his parachute automatically as he fell away from the disintegrating aircraft. He plummeted 1,500 feet through the night sky, falling through burning debris and continuing anti-aircraft fire. His parachute managed to open, but just barely. One panel of the canopy was actively on fire. 2 other panels had been shredded by shrapnel. Jake impacted the ground with tremendous force, landing in a flooded field that immediately submerged him. His combat gear dragged him down beneath the water's surface. He managed to cut through his parachute harness and kicked toward the surface, gasping desperately for air as he emerged. The scene surrounding him was absolute chaos. Aircraft were burning as they fell from the sky. Parachutes were drifting helplessly into German-controlled positions. Gunfire echoed from every direction across the landscape. Jake pulled his rifle free from the water, conducted a quick check of his ammunition supply, and then began the process of searching for his men. By the time dawn arrived, Jake had successfully located 9 members of the Filthy 13. 4 of his men were confirmed dead. The rest remained scattered somewhere across Normandy, their locations unknown. But 9 men would prove to be enough for what needed to be done. Jake gathered his survivors together and explained what their mission would be. Their original orders had been to secure a bridge located at Chef du Pont. The bridge crossed the Murderet River. Military intelligence considered it critical for blocking German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. The problem facing them was simple and stark. Jake had 9 men under his command. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans had at least 200 soldiers defending the area around the bridge. Jake's solution to this problem was even simpler than the problem itself. They would attack anyway, regardless of the odds. At 6:34 in the morning on June 6th, Jake and his 9 paratroopers launched their attack on the German positions surrounding Chef du Pont. They employed the same tactics Jake had learned during his poaching days back in Oklahoma. Move quietly through cover. Use the terrain to your advantage. Strike fast and hard, then disappear before the enemy can react. The Germans were absolutely not expecting a force of only 9 men to launch an attack against 200 defenders. Jake's squad moved carefully through the hedgerows, established ambush positions, and exploited German confusion to maximum effect. By 9 in the morning, additional American paratroopers had managed to link up with Jake's group. His force of 9 men expanded to 35 soldiers. By 11 in the morning, they had successfully captured the bridge at Chef du Pont. The German forces retreated to regroup and prepare for a counterattack. At 2:17 in the afternoon, German artillery batteries began targeting the bridge with sustained fire. Jake and his men dug defensive positions, fortified their lines, and prepared themselves to hold the position. At 4:43 in the afternoon, American P-47 fighter aircraft appeared in the sky overhead. Jake's men began waving their arms, signaling frantically, doing everything possible to identify themselves as friendly American forces. The P-47s circled the area once and then proceeded to bomb the bridge. American planes were bombing American paratroopers simply because someone back at headquarters had mistakenly believed the bridge was still under German control. The bombs completely destroyed the bridge that Jake's men had spent the entire day capturing at great risk. Jake stood there watching as his bridge collapsed and fell into the Murderet River below. He watched as the mission he'd risked 35 lives to accomplish literally crumbled into rubble before his eyes. Then, remarkably, he started laughing at the absurdity of it all. Because, of course, the Air Force would bomb their own soldiers. Of course, the Army would destroy the very bridge they'd ordered paratroopers to capture in the first place. Jake's men looked at him as if he'd completely lost his mind. Jake explained the situation to them in clear, simple terms. They had just captured a bridge that the Army apparently no longer needed or wanted, which meant that now they found themselves stuck behind German lines with no mission to accomplish, no supplies to sustain them, and no way to get back home. So they might as well make the Germans deeply regret ever encountering them. Jake repositioned his men on the high ground that overlooked the destroyed bridge. He established machine gun positions and prepared defensive lines. If the Germans wanted control of this crossing point, they would have to advance through 35 paratroopers who literally had nothing left to lose at this point. But Jake didn't just randomly dig in without a plan. He understood something fundamental about defensive warfare that most officers never learned during their entire careers. Terrain determines the outcome of battles, not the number of soldiers involved. The high ground overlooking the destroyed bridge featured 3 natural choke points in the landscape. These were narrow approaches where any attacking force would be forced to bunch together. They represented perfect killing zones for defensive fire. Jake positioned his .30 caliber machine guns to provide coverage over those choke points, creating overlapping fields of fire. Any German soldier attempting to advance through those areas would receive fire from multiple angles simultaneously. He placed his most skilled riflemen in elevated positions where they had clear sight lines across the entire approach, instructing them to target German officers and NCOs first in every engagement, operating on the principle that if you kill the leadership, the entire attack tends to fall apart. He positioned his bar gunners with the specific mission of suppressing German support weapons, including machine gun teams and mortar crews, anything that could potentially provide covering fire for advancing German infantry. And he maintained a mobile reserve force consisting of 5 men. Their job was straightforward: plug any holes that appeared in the defensive line. If Germans managed to break through at any point, this reserve would immediately counterattack that position. Jake explained the complete plan to his 35 men, and he told them the unvarnished truth about their situation. No reinforcements were coming to help them. They had no supplies, and there was no escape route available. The bridge they'd captured was now destroyed. The mission, as originally conceived, was over and done with. But 700 German soldiers were about to launch an attack on their position, and Jake's men faced a simple choice: either surrender or make those Germans pay dearly for every single inch of ground they tried to take. His paratroopers made their choice and decided to fight. Jake gave them one additional instruction that would prove critical: conserve your ammunition carefully. Make absolutely every shot count toward a target. The Germans had virtually unlimited supplies at their disposal. Jake's men had only whatever ammunition they'd managed to carry with them from the landing zone. If they ran out of bullets before the Germans ran out of soldiers, they would lose this fight. It was as simple as that. The men settled into their defensive positions, conducted final checks on their weapons, and then waited for what was coming. On June 7th at 8:00 in the morning, German scouts approached the destroyed bridge to assess the situation, observed American paratroopers dug into defensive positions on the high ground, and reported their findings back to command. On June 8th, the Germans began probing Jake's defenses with exploratory attacks. These were small squad-level assaults designed to test the American positions and identify weaknesses. Jake's men killed every single one of them. On June 9th, at 7:22 in the morning, the German officer made his appearance carrying his white flag. He commanded 700 soldiers, had multiple machine gun positions established, and had artillery support available. The Germans possessed overwhelming force by any reasonable measure. The officer dismounted from his horse, walked directly up to Jake, and formally demanded his surrender. Jake was completely out of food at this point and out of water as well. His men had been reduced to eating grass and drinking water from puddles to survive. But Jake Callister had already survived an aircraft explosion, swam his way out of a flooded field, captured a strategically important bridge, watched his own Air Force deliberately destroy it, and spent 3 full days being shot at by German soldiers. He was decidedly not in any mood to surrender at this point. Jake informed the German officer that he was welcome to attack, if that's what he wanted to do. But he should understand one thing clearly: Jake's 35 paratroopers were dug into fortified positions on high ground with overlapping fields of fire established, and they'd been eating grass for 3 straight days, which had made them extremely irritable and unpleasant to deal with. The German officer countered by saying that Jake's position was hopeless from any strategic perspective. Reinforcements were not coming to save them. Supplies were not being delivered. Surrender represented the only logical choice available. Jake responded by saying that logic was really only useful for people who hadn't just watched their own Air Force bomb them deliberately. The German officer returned to his lines to prepare for the assault. At 9:14 in the morning, the German attack officially began. 700 soldiers began advancing uphill toward the American positions. Machine guns opened fire, providing suppressing fire, and artillery shells began falling on American defensive positions. Jake's men held their fire and waited patiently. They let the Germans fully commit to their attack, allowed them to bunch up on the approach routes as predicted. The Germans moved forward in 3 distinct waves. The first wave consisted of 200 infantry soldiers. The second wave brought another 200 soldiers with machine gun support teams. The third wave held 300 soldiers in reserve. This was standard German assault doctrine in action. The plan was to overwhelm the defense through superior numbers and firepower. Under normal circumstances, it should have worked effectively. The first German wave hit those narrow choke points, exactly as Jake had predicted they would. Soldiers bunched together tightly on the approach trails. They made perfect targets for defensive fire. Jake waited patiently until they had closed to within 100 yards of his positions. Then, and only then, did he give the order to open fire. 35 paratroopers unleashed every weapon they had available: M1 Garand rifles, Bar automatic rifles, 30 caliber machine guns, and grenades. The effect on the German assault was absolutely catastrophic. The 30 caliber machine guns opened fire first. Each gun was capable of 500 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds reached down the slope like visible fingers of death. German soldiers began falling in groups rather than individually. The riflemen followed immediately with the machine guns. They fired disciplined, carefully aimed shots at selected targets. Jake's men had spent months training to shoot both fast and accurate under pressure. Now all that training was paying immediate dividends in the most brutal way possible. German soldiers continued to fall across the hillside. Their forward advance ground to a complete halt. Men desperately dove for cover that simply didn't exist in those exposed positions. The bar gunners focused their fire on suppressing German machine gun teams that were attempting to establish support positions. The Germans found themselves unable to establish any kind of base of fire. They couldn't provide any covering fire for their advancing infantry forces. Without that covering fire, the German infantry found themselves completely exposed. They were advancing uphill directly into concentrated American defensive fire with nowhere to hide. The first assault wave collapsed within just a few minutes of contact. Bodies began piling up on the slope, and wounded soldiers filled the air with their screaming. The survivors who could still move retreated back down the hill in disorder. Jake's men had been firing for maybe 3 minutes total. German casualties from that first assault numbered at least 40 dead or wounded soldiers. American casualties remained at exactly 0. The Germans regrouped their forces and attempted another assault at 11 bars in the morning. This time, they brought mortar support and began dropping rounds on Jake's positions before the infantry advanced. The mortar barrage was heavy and sustained. Explosions walked systematically across the American defensive line, with shrapnel tearing through the trees above them. But Jake had positioned his men in defilade, which means behind the crest of the hill where they were protected. The mortar rounds were falling on the forward slope of the hill, not on the reverse slope where his men had actually dug their defensive positions. The barrage looked extremely impressive to any observer. It sounded absolutely terrifying to anyone nearby, but it accomplished essentially nothing in terms of casualties. When the mortars finally stopped firing, the German infantry advanced once again. The result was identical to the first assault. Jake's machine guns systematically cut them down as they advanced. His riflemen picked off anyone who managed to get close to the defensive positions. The bar gunners continued suppressing German support weapons effectively. The second assault wave lasted approximately 5 minutes before it also collapsed in failure. German casualties from this attack added another 50 dead or wounded soldiers to their losses. American casualties still remained at exactly 0. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the Germans brought up artillery batteries and began shelling Jake's positions directly with heavy fire. Jake's men hunkered down in their positions, survived the sustained barrage, and waited for it to end. At 4 in the afternoon, the Germans launched yet another attack, but this time they brought tank support with them. 2 Panzer IV tanks, each equipped with 75mm main guns, multiple machine guns, and thick armor plating that M1 Garand rifle bullets simply could not penetrate. Jake's men had no bazookas in their inventory, no anti-tank weapons of any kind, and no practical way to kill armored vehicles. The Army had promised that anti-tank weapons would be delivered to them after the initial drop. That delivery never happened. The tanks rumbled up the road toward Jake's defensive position. German infantry followed closely behind them, using the tanks as mobile cover to protect their advance. Jake observed the situation through his binoculars and quickly assessed what was happening. The tanks were advancing along the main road. This was the only approach route wide enough to accommodate armored vehicles. The road ran through a narrow defile between 2 hills. It represented a perfect ambush site under different circumstances. But Jake couldn't ambush the tanks themselves with the weapons available to him. However, he could certainly ambush the infantry forces following behind them. He repositioned 2 of his machine gun teams with new instructions. He told them to completely ignore the tanks and focus absolutely all their fire on the German infantry instead. When the tanks reached the narrowest part of the defile, Jake's machine guns opened fire with devastating effect, not at the tanks themselves, but at the soldiers walking behind them for protection. The German infantry immediately scattered in panic, dove for whatever cover they could find, and completely stopped advancing forward. The tanks continued moving forward, but now they were advancing without any infantry support whatsoever. This left them vulnerable. Not vulnerable to Jake's actual weapons, but vulnerable to the terrain itself. The road through the defile was extremely narrow. There were steep embankments on both sides of the road. The tanks had no choice but to stay on the road or risk becoming stuck in the terrain. And staying on that road meant they couldn't maneuver around obstacles, couldn't attempt to flank the American positions, and couldn't achieve proper firing angles on Jake's defensive positions. The tanks fired their main guns repeatedly. 75mm shells screamed across the distance and slammed into the hillside. Explosions tore up dirt and shredded trees across the landscape. But Jake's men were dug in on the reverse slope of the hill. The tank rounds were impacting on the forward slope instead. The explosions were close enough to feel the concussion, but too far away to actually kill anyone. The tanks physically couldn't elevate their main guns high enough to hit Jake's positions effectively. The angle was simply too steep for their gun elevation limits, so the tanks just sat there on the road, firing uselessly into the hillside, while Jake's men methodically killed every single German soldier who attempted to provide them with infantry support. After 30 minutes of this futile exchange, the tanks retreated back down the road, having run out of infantry targets and lacking any infantry support to continue. Jake's defensive plan had worked to absolute perfection. The terrain had completely negated the advantage of German armor. The choke points had negated their numerical superiority. American casualties still remained at exactly 0. By nightfall on June 9th, the Germans had launched 5 major attacks against Jake's position. Every single attack had failed completely. German casualties stood at 127 confirmed dead, with hundreds more wounded. American casualties remained at exactly 0. On June 10th, at dawn, American reinforcements finally arrived at the position. Elements of the 82nd Airborne Division had fought their way through German lines to reach Jake's defensive position. The relief force commander found Jake and his 35 men still firmly holding the high ground. He requested a status report on the situation. Jake reported that they were completely out of food, totally out of water, and had run completely out of patience with the entire situation. But the Germans had not succeeded in taking the position from them. The commander asked how many casualties Jake's force had sustained during the defense. Jake stated that he had 0 casualties. The commander didn't believe him at first. He assumed Jake must be in shock from the sustained combat. He asked again for clarification. Jake repeated his statement. 0 casualties. Then he asked whether the relief force had brought any food with them, because his men were thoroughly tired of eating grass. The army eventually pieced together what had actually happened at that position. 35 paratroopers had successfully held a destroyed bridge against 700 German soldiers for 72 continuous hours. They had achieved 0 friendly casualties while inflicting over 100 German dead. Nobody in the chain of command knew quite what to do with that information or how to process it. By all rights, Jake Callister should have received the Medal of Honor for this action. He should have been promoted in rank. He should have been formally recognized for his achievement. Instead, he received a Bronze Star medal and new orders to report for his next combat mission. The Army had learned something important about Jake Callister through all of this. He was far too effective at killing enemy soldiers to waste his time on promotions and ceremonial functions. By December 1944, Jake had survived 6 full months of continuous combat operations in France. The Filthy 13 had been reduced to just 4 original members, still alive and serving. The rest had been killed, wounded severely enough for evacuation, or transferred to other units. On December 16th, Germany launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces completely surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at the town of Bastogne, Belgium. 11,000 American soldiers found themselves totally cut off from friendly forces. They had no supplies getting through and no reinforcements coming to help them. The Army desperately needed someone willing to jump into a surrounded city and set up radio equipment to coordinate resupplied drops for the trapped forces. They asked for volunteers to undertake this mission. Jake Callister's hand went up without hesitation. On December 18th at 3:47 in the morning, Jake and 9 other Pathfinders climbed aboard C-47 transport aircraft. Their mission was straightforward but extraordinarily dangerous. Parachute directly into Bastogne, establish reliable radio contact with command, and coordinate resupply drops for the surrounded forces. The weather conditions were absolutely terrible. Heavy fog blanketed everything, creating zero visibility. German anti-aircraft positions completely surrounded the city. The C-47 pilot stated plainly that the mission was suicidal. There was no way to see the drop zone below them, and no way to avoid the flak guns waiting for them. Jake responded that this was perfectly fine with him. He'd survived worse situations before. At 7:23 in the morning, Jake's aircraft reached the airspace above Bastogne. The pilot couldn't see the ground below them. He couldn't see the city, could only make out white fog and the occasional burst of German tracer fire cutting through it. The jump master told Jake to jump anyway, despite the conditions. Jake jumped into that fog at 1,000 feet altitude with absolutely no idea where he would land. His parachute opened as designed. He fell through the clouds blind, then hit the ground with considerable force. He had landed in the middle of Bastogne, surrounded immediately by American soldiers from the 101st, who were absolutely shocked to see anyone parachuting into the surrounded city. Jake asked them where the German positions were located. A sergeant pointed in literally every direction around them, explaining that the Germans had completely encircled the city. Jake asked where his other Pathfinders had landed after the jump. The sergeant reported that 3 had landed safely inside the American perimeter. The rest had landed outside the perimeter and were probably either captured or killed by German forces. Jake refused to accept that assessment as final. He spent the next 2 hours actively searching the city, dodging German fire constantly, locating scattered Pathfinders wherever they'd landed. By 9 in the morning, he'd successfully found 8 of his 10 men. 2 were confirmed dead from the jump, but 8 Pathfinders would be enough to accomplish the mission. Jake split his team into 2 separate groups, positioning one on the east side of Bastogne and one on the west side. Each team set up their radio equipment and started bouncing signals back and forth between positions to prevent the Germans from triangulating their exact location through radio direction finding. At 10:17 in the morning, Jake made his first radio call. His message to Allied Command was simple. Bastogne to Allied Command. Americans still holding the city. Request immediate resupply drop. Allied Command responded within seconds. They said they would dispatch C-47s immediately to begin drops. At 11:34 in the morning, the first resupply drop arrived over the city. A single C-47 flying low through those heavy clouds. German flak guns opened up on it immediately. The plane dropped its supply bundles, food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The bundles landed successfully inside the American perimeter. The C-47 survived the flak barrage and flew away safely. Jake called in another drop immediately, then another one after that, then another. For the next 24 hours straight, Jake's Pathfinder teams coordinated continuous resupply drops into Bastogne. The weather remained terrible throughout, with visibility near zero. German flak fire was constant and intense, but the C-47 pilots kept coming back regardless. They were flying completely blind, relying entirely on Jake's radio coordinates to find the drop zone. By December 20th at 10:17 in the morning, Jake's team had successfully called in 247 successful resupply drops. 247 aircraft had made it through, delivering thousands of pounds of supplies. Everything the 101st needed to continue fighting and holding out. When General Patton's Third Army finally broke through German lines on December 26th, the 101st Airborne was still actively fighting, still holding Bastogne against all odds. The Battle of the Bulge ended as a German defeat, largely because Bastogne never fell to enemy forces. Bastogne didn't fall because Jake Callister had jumped into a surrounded city and called in 247 resupply drops, while Germans actively tried to kill him the entire time. The Army didn't award Jake any medal for his actions at Bastogne. Pathfinder operations were classified as secret at that time. But Jake didn't care about medals anyway. He'd kept 11,000 American soldiers alive and fighting. That was enough satisfaction for him. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Jake and the 101st moved into Germany as occupation forces. They discovered Hermann Göring's abandoned castle, complete with expensive liquor collections and stolen racehorse thoroughbreds. Jake and his men decided to throw a rodeo celebration, drank Göring's expensive liquor, and rode his prized horses around the grounds in one massive, chaotic party. During this celebration, Jake met a German woman named Amelia and began dating her. He found out later that her father had been the leader of the local Hitler Youth chapter. Jake thought that particular situation was absolutely hilarious. Eventually, the Army sent Jake back home to Arkansas for medical treatment and evaluation. While there, Jake got into another physical altercation with military police. This time around, he actually threatened the MP commander directly. He told him that once he became a civilian again, he'd come back and settle their issues properly. The Army made a final decision that Jake Callister was more trouble than he could possibly be worth to keep in service. They discharged him from the military. The discharge was honorable. 3 years, 5 months, and 26 days of total service. 4 combat jumps into enemy territory, hundreds of confirmed enemy kills, multiple impossible missions completed successfully, and he was never promoted beyond the rank of private. Jake returned to Oklahoma and struggled with severe alcoholism for several years following his return. Then he had a near-fatal drunk driving accident. The alcoholism wasn't some random development without cause. Jake had killed hundreds of men during the war, watched close friends die in combat, and survived situations that logically should have killed him as well. And when he finally came home, nobody understood what he'd been through. Nobody wanted to hear about Chef Dupont or Bastogne, or what it actually felt like to watch your plane explode at 1,500 feet. They just wanted the war to be over and finished. They wanted Jake to go back to being normal, as if that were somehow possible. But Jake wasn't normal anymore, and he never would be again. He'd spent 4 years functioning as a weapon for the military. The Army had simply pointed him at Germans, and he'd killed them efficiently and without hesitation or remorse. Now the Army was finished with him, and Jake had absolutely no idea how to be anything except a highly trained killer. So he drank heavily. Because drinking made those memories quieter in his head, made the nightmares occur less frequently at night. The drunk driving accident happened in 1951. Jake wrapped his car around a telephone pole outside Ponca City. He suffered a fractured skull and broken ribs in the crash. The attending doctor said that by all rights he should have died from his injuries. Jake regained consciousness in the hospital 3 days later. He looked at himself and realized he was actively destroying the life he'd fought so hard to come home to. That night, lying in that hospital bed, Jake found God. Not through some dramatic vision or moment of divine intervention. Jake simply decided that if he'd managed to survive an aircraft explosion, multiple German attacks, and now a drunk driving accident, maybe someone or something was trying to communicate a message to him. He quit drinking that same week and never touched alcohol again for the rest of his life. He got married 6 months later. Her name was Mary Catherine, an Oklahoma girl through and through. She knew Jake had served in the military, knew he'd been a paratrooper during the war. She didn't know any of the specific details. Jake never told her the full story, never told anyone really. He got a job working at the Ponca City Post Office, started selling stamps and sorting mail, living a quiet and peaceful life. He had 3 children with Mary Catherine, raised them well with love and discipline, coached Little League baseball teams, and attended church every Sunday without fail. He became the kind of man who'd never broken a sergeant's nose over a butter ration, never fired MP's pistols into street signs, and never told a German officer to attack uphill into fortified machine gun positions. His children knew that their father had served in World War II. They had no idea he'd been simultaneously the Army's worst discipline problem and most effective killer. Jake kept things that way intentionally, with deliberate purpose. He didn't want his children growing up thinking that war was somehow glorious or romantic. He didn't want them idolizing violence in any form. War had been necessary at that time in history. Jake had been exceptionally good at waging it, but it wasn't something to celebrate or glorify. He spent the remainder of his life working at the Ponca City Post Office, selling stamps and sorting mail day after day. Nobody working at the post office knew that Jake had survived an aircraft explosion on D-Day. Nobody knew he'd held off 700 Germans with just 35 men. Nobody knew he'd saved Bastogne from falling. Jake never talked about any of it with anyone. He lived quietly and peacefully, raised his family with care, attended church faithfully, and died in 2013 at the age of 93. The Army had tried to discharge him 8 separate times during his training period. He survived D-Day after his plane exploded in midair, captured a strategically important bridge, and held that position against 700 Germans for 72 hours, while sustaining 0 casualties among his men. He jumped into the surrounded city of Bastogne and called in 247 resupply drops that saved 11,000 American soldiers from starvation and defeat. And then he spent the next 40 years selling stamps in Oklahoma, living a quiet life, which was exactly what he'd always wanted from the beginning, because Jake Callister never wanted fame or recognition. He never wanted medals or promotions or public acknowledgement. He wanted to kill Nazis, eat a good breakfast, and go home to live his life. He accomplished all 3 of those goals completely. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who've been forgotten by history. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're actively rescuing these stories from archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a passive viewer. You're actively part of keeping these memories alive for future generations. Tell us your location in the comments. Tell us if someone in your family served in the military. Just let us know you're here and that these stories matter to you.